Welcome to the lecture on a selection from Section 1 of Chapter 7 of Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the issue of economic justice, also sometimes called distributive justice in the way that we'll be talking about it. We'll be looking at Robert Nozick's particular theory of economic or distributive justice, which is called the historical entitlement theory of economic or distributive justice. When we're looking at the issue of economic or distributive justice, we're looking at the issue of the ethical concerns that would drive our considerations when it comes to who has what stuff, how much property should each person have, what principles, what concerns should guide us in deciding how much property each person has, who has which pieces of property. Says Nozick, a distribution is just if it arises from another just distribution by legitimate means. The legitimate means of moving from one distribution to another are specified by the principle of justice in transfer. The legitimate first moves are specified by the principle of justice in acquisition. Whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. The means of change specified by the principle of justice in transfer preserve justice. The means of transition from one situation to another specified by the principle of justice in transfer are justice preserving. Robert Nozick was a very famous late 20th century political philosopher, epistemologist, and decision theorist who spent much of his later career at Harvard University, along with another political philosopher named John Rawls. Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is what we'll be discussing in this lecture, is a response that Nozick wrote in 1974 to Rawls's very famous A Theory of Justice, which was written in 1971. Since what we'll be discussing today is an issue in political philosophy, it'll help to remind ourselves what political philosophy is. Political philosophy is the philosophical subdiscipline concerned with the specifically normative, that is, the ought-related questions regarding political entities, political powers, and political relations. Some of the questions, although not all of the questions, asked by political philosophers are, what makes something a political state, rather than, for example, a mere collection of people? What distinguishes legitimate states from illegitimate ones? Are there some things that claim to be states, that call themselves states, that are not morally acceptable and are therefore illegitimate? What grounds political authority and political obligation? That is, why is it that states can tell people what to do and their citizens need to obey? What is the proper scope of the political state? What are the conditions for citizenship, both to remain a citizen and to become a citizen? What are the legitimate forms of political government? So, for example, is democracy the only legitimate form of a political government, or are there other forms of government, like maybe oligarchy, or plutocracy, or monarchy, that might be legitimate forms of a political government? And finally, under what conditions can a state be overthrown? If citizens are unhappy with the state, is that sufficient, or does something more need to happen? The questions that we'll be talking about today fit most plausibly into this fourth question. What is the proper scope of the political state? We'll be asking about property ownership. And one of the implications of property ownership is what should the state be concerned with respect to the ownership of property? Should the state respect certain claims to property rights over others? Can the state take things away from people, even if people claim to have property rights? In understanding what political philosophy is, it's also important to contrast political philosophy with a sister discipline, political science. While political philosophy and political science study the same sorts of things, namely political objects, they study these things from two different perspectives and with two different sets of methodological tools. So what distinguishes the political scientist from the political philosopher is not what is studied, but the perspective and the methodology used to study those things. The political scientist is concerned with the descriptive issues of what states are in their various manifestations, how states and citizens actually do and have interacted with one another. The methodology of the political scientist, therefore, is historical, anthropological, and sociological in nature. In contrast, the political philosopher is concerned with normative issues of how states ought to be, how states and citizens ought to interact with one another, and the reasons why things ought to be this way. The methodology of the political philosopher, then, is philosophical in nature, and it's primarily concerned with philosophical ethical questions and uses the methods of philosophical ethics. So you can see the central methodological concern that separates the political scientist from the political philosopher is whether we're doing work about what is the case or work about what ought to be the case. Since we're discussing property and ownership in this lecture, it's also important to notice the relationship between political philosophy and economics. Economics, as an academic discipline, just like political science, is descriptive. It looks to explain and predict economic phenomena. Economics isn't concerned with questions of what ought to be the case, unless we're saying, here's the goal that we've picked. What's the easiest or best way to get there? Economics isn't concerned broadly with deeper questions than that about what the best economic system is, where the political philosopher might be concerned with that. Political philosophy is sometimes concerned with specifically economic issues. However, as we've noted, it's concerned with these issues from a normative and often ethical perspective. Two of the central economic issues that concern political philosophers are the issues of justice and fairness in property, and the issues of justice and fairness in taxation. What we'll be talking about in this lecture touches directly on both the issues of property and taxation in terms of what ought to be the case with property rights, property claims, and legitimate forms of taxation. A concept that it'll be important for us to understand as we discuss the particularly philosophical issues that surround economic concerns of societies and their political manifestations is the concept of an economic distribution. This terminology can sometimes be a little bit confusing to students, so it's important to pay attention to exactly what an economic distribution is and to not infer from non-philosophical usage of any of these terms other definitions that don't line up with the usage of these terms in philosophical discourses. An economic distribution is a way all owned property is dispersed amongst all possible property owners in a population at a particular time. When time passes, or when the population changes, or when the amount of total property changes, we move from one distribution to the next distribution to the next distribution. So let's take a very simple, admittedly overly simplified example population of 5 people named Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith, A, B, C, D, and E, in order to understand this notion of an economic distribution. Here is one possible economic distribution. Notice what we have here. All of the property is dispersed in a particular way amongst all of the possible property owners in this population at this particular time. Anne has a certain amount, Bob has a little more, Carol has a little more, Dave has a little more than that, and Edith has quite a bit more than any of them. Here's another example economic distribution using this same population and the same total amount of property. Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, and Edith in this distribution all have exactly the same amount of property. It's another distribution, a distribution that's different from the first one, because the disbursement, the way that the property is arranged in the population, is different here than it was in the first distribution. Let's look at one final distribution. In this distribution, Edith has everything. Anne, Bob, Carol, Dave, they have none of the property, and Edith has all of the property. Just looking at an economic distribution, all on its own, before we have a theory of what makes an economic distribution good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, doesn't tell us anything about whether it's a good economic distribution or not. So, when we do political philosophy that's concerned with economic issues, instead of talking about whether one particular person is doing the right thing, or whether what one particular person has or some group of people have at a particular time is what they ought to have, instead, we can talk about the entire economic distribution, the properties of the distribution, how the distribution got that way, etc. And by talking about the entire distribution, we can then talk about whether distributions themselves are just or unjust. But again, we're going to need some theory that tells us whether, for any particular distribution, it's a good one or a bad one. In general, there are two broad ways that political philosophers use to determine the justice of particular economic distributions. These ways are known as historical theories and end state theories of the justice of economic distributions. Now, these theories can be combined with each other. It's not as though everyone who endorses one sort of principles only endorses one sort of principles and not the other. Although, as we'll see with Nozick, Nozick does only end up endorsing one of these two sorts of principles. Let's learn about what these principles are. A historical theory of the justice of economic distributions appeals to historical principles concerning how a distribution came into existence in order to determine whether that distribution is just or unjust. The specific pattern of the distribution, or the specific internal economic relations within the distribution, are irrelevant to historical theories. All that matters for a historical theory is how you got there. It doesn't matter who has what. It doesn't matter how much of the stuff any particular person has. What matters is how you got there. In contrast, an end state theory of the justice of economic distributions appeals to patterning principles concerning the specific internal economic relations within the distribution to determine whether that distribution is just or unjust. For the end state theorist, details concerning how the distribution came into existence are irrelevant. So for the end state theorist, we look at the particular relations within the distribution at that particular time, who has what, who has how much of what, and we can tell from that whether the distribution is just or unjust. It doesn't matter how you got to that distribution. What matters is who has what at particular times. Nozick's theory that he lays out in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is a theory that endorses historical principles and historical principles alone. What that means for Nozick's theory is that when Nozick is considering whether some particular economic distribution is just or unjust, he only cares about how we got to that distribution and not about the internal properties of the distribution, who has what at any particular time. So let's look at Nozick's particular historical principles. These are stated in an abstract, schematic way so that we can apply them to any possible situation to see whether that situation is one in which we've got a just or an unjust distribution. So that's why you'll see variables here. According to Nozick, for any particular economic distribution that you have, any way that things are dispersed amongst all possible property owners at a particular time, call that distribution D2. That distribution is just if and only if that distribution, D2, first arose from a previous just economic distribution, D1, 2, the move from D1, that previous economic distribution, to D2, the economic distribution that we're analyzing, arose via individual or repeated applications of one or more of the following principles. A. Principles of justice in property acquisition. B. Principles of justice in property transfer. C. Principles of justice in property abandonment. Or D. Principles of justice in the rectification of past injustices. And finally, no other principles than those enumerated in step 2 brought about D2 from D1. So this gives us a schematic understanding, a procedural understanding of how we can get a just economic distribution. So you can see here with these historical principles that Nozick doesn't care in any distribution who has what or how much of the stuff any particular person has. What Nozick cares about is how you got to a distribution. If you start with a just distribution, one that is that has the property of justice, an acceptable distribution, and then you use only principles of justice to change that distribution into another distribution, then the new distribution that you end up with will also be a just distribution, says Nozick. And there are 4 principles that allow you to move from one distribution to another distribution in a way that preserves justice. Those are the principles of justice in acquisition, transfer, abandonment, and the rectification of past injustices. So let's look at each of those principles in turn. Justice in property acquisition. This is how you can come to own something that was unowned. Not how you can come to own something that was owned by somebody else, but if something is unowned, nobody owns it. This principle, the principle of justice in property acquisition, tells you how you can come to own it in a just fashion. For any person who is capable of owning property, just call that person S. And for some piece of property, just call that thing P. If P, that property, is unowned, that is, if no one owns P, then our person, S, can come to own that property, P, so long as S's coming to own P is not a violation of the Lockean proviso. The Lockean proviso, named after John Locke, says this: unowned property, P, can come to be owned by a person, S, so long as P's coming to be owned by S does not leave people other than S worse off. People other than S are not left worse off by S's coming to own P, so long as S's coming to own P leaves enough and as good of the type of thing P is for anyone other than S who might wish to come to own something of the type of thing that P is. This can sound a little confusing at first, but it's actually very intuitive. So consider this. Consider that I go out to a meadow. The meadow is unowned, let's say, and I want a flower, and there are millions of flowers in the meadow. I take a flower and I say, this is my flower now. According to the Lockean proviso, I'm allowed to do that so long as I don't take a flower that's so unbelievable that it's the best flower there or one of the very few unbelievable flowers there. And also, so long as there are enough flowers left over that anyone else who might want one. Now, this doesn't mean there need to be enough for everybody in the world. It just means that there are enough for anyone else who might want one. Anyone else who might want one could have one too. So by taking a flower from a meadow, as long as that flower isn't owned by somebody because the meadow is owned by somebody, I haven't left anybody else worse off because I've left enough and as good of those flowers for everybody else. Let's consider something else. Let's say that I'm walking through the woods after I come to own my flower, and I come across a gigantic golden tree, a tree that's made of all gold. And I can also tell from the way that the tree is shimmering that it's magical. The magical golden tree is unowned, but according to the Lockean proviso, I can't come to own that tree because it's so amazing, and there's only one of them, that if I took it, if I came to own it, I would be leaving anybody else who might want one of those worse off because there aren't any more of those. So since I wouldn't be leaving enough and as good of golden magical trees for anybody else who might want one, I'm not allowed to have that thing. That's the principle of justice in property acquisition. If somebody acquires property in a way that doesn't violate the Lockean proviso, and that's the only difference between two distributions, then our new distribution will be just so long as our old distribution was. Let's look at the principles of justice in property transfer and abandonment. I've put them together here because they're essentially the same principle. For any two people who are capable of owning property, call these people S1 and S2, and for some piece of property, P, if P is legitimately owned by S1, S2 can come to own P, and S1 can lose ownership of P, if and only if both S1 and S2 agree in a free and uncoerced manner to the transfer of P from S1 to S2. So consider this. I own a book. Let's say that I own a copy of Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And let's say that I legitimately own that. I didn't steal it from somebody or something like that. If you want the book, if you and I can come to some agreement, maybe I'll just give you the book, or maybe you'll trade me money for the book, or maybe you'll trade me some other piece of property that you have for the book. If we come to an agreement in a free and uncoerced manner that the property, the book, will transfer from me to you, that's now your book. So if we have a distribution that differs from its past distribution only in terms of property transfer that is in line with this principle, if the old distribution was just, then the new one will be just as well. Whenever you go to a store and buy something, what you've engaged in is a free and uncoerced transfer of property for property. Now, people can also abandon property that they own in much the same way here. To abandon property is to take property that you own and make it such that nobody owns it anymore. So it's to put it back out into the pool of unowned things. A person can abandon property in this way. For any person, S, who owns some piece of property, P, S can abandon P such that S loses possession of P and P becomes unowned if, and only if, S desires in a free and uncoerced manner to lose possession of P such that P becomes unowned. So this is not the same thing as donating a piece of property to somebody else. That would be a transfer of property. Let's imagine my example with the flower again. I came to own the flower. It was mine because I didn't violate the Lockean proviso. But now I don't want the flower anymore. I can abandon the flower if I just put it back down in the meadow. Now it's not mine anymore. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you can just abandon property wherever you want. You can't just put your car in somebody's front yard and say, well, it's a free and uncoerced property abandonment. There are also going to be restrictions about how and where you can abandon property, and these will be concerned primarily with other people's property rights. But if you don't want something anymore, so long as nobody's forcing you to get rid of it, you can abandon it, and principles of justice have been followed. And then finally, there's a principle of justice in the rectification of past injustices. Here's a quotation from Nozick. If past injustice has shaped present holdings, that's just who owns things, in various ways, some identifiable and some not, what now, if anything, ought to be done to rectify these injustices? I do not know, says Nozick, of a thorough or theoretically sophisticated treatment of such issues. Idealizing greatly, though, let us suppose theoretical investigation will produce a principle of rectification. This principle uses historical information about previous situations and injustices done in them, and information about the actual course of events that flowed from these injustices until the present, and it yields a description or descriptions of holdings in the society. The principle of rectification presumably will make use of its best estimate of subjunctive information about what would have occurred, or a probability distribution over what might have occurred using the expected value if the injustice had not taken place. Now, this is very complicated. Essentially, what Nozick is saying here, at the fundamental level, is that if you violate principles of justice in acquisition, transfer, or abandonment, if you steal things from people, if you take things in a way that violates the Lockean proviso, at some point down the line, this needs to be rectified. You don't just get to have it because you stole it and nobody caught you for a little while. It's still unjust for you to own this or for somebody to have stolen something from you. So, for example, imagine that I steal your phone from you and I sell it to somebody who sells it to somebody who sells it to somebody. That final person, even though they bought the phone, bought a stolen good. That wasn't the person who sold its phone to sell. So we would be justified in taking the phone back and giving it back to its rightful owner. It's unfortunate that somebody paid for that stolen good, but it wasn't the property of the person who took it. So if we want to be concerned with justice, says Nozick, we need to make sure that we are rectifying past injustices. Let's take a look at a very, very famous example that Nozick gives us to try to understand an application of his principles of justice. This is the example of Wilt Chamberlain. Here's a long quotation from Nozick. Suppose that Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand by basketball teams, being a great gate attraction. He signs the following sort of contract with a team. In each home game, 25 cents from the price of each ticket of admission goes to him, Wilt Chamberlain. The season starts and people cheerfully attend his team's games. They buy their tickets, each time dropping a separate 25 cents of their admission price into a special box with Chamberlain's name on it. They're excited about seeing him play. It is worth the total admission price to them. Let us suppose that in one season, 1 million persons attend his home games, and Wilt Chamberlain winds up with $250,000, a much larger sum than the average income and larger even than anyone else has. Is he entitled to this income? Is this new distribution, D2, unjust? If so, why? Each of these persons chose to give 25 cents of their money to Chamberlain. They could have spent it on going to the movies or on candy bars, but they all, at least 1 million of them, converged on giving it to Wilt Chamberlain in exchange for watching him play basketball. If D1, the distribution before they all ended up paying Wilt Chamberlain 25 cents extra, was a just distribution, and people voluntarily moved from it to D2, transferring parts of their shares they were given under D1, isn't D2 also just? Well, if everybody freely and uncoercedly decided to give this money to Wilt Chamberlain, even though in the end Wilt Chamberlain ends up with quite a bit of extra money. In 1974, $250,000 was quite a bit. It's still quite a bit of money. Is Wilt Chamberlain entitled to have that money? This is the central question that Nozick is asking us with his principles of justice. What entitles you to the stuff that you have? It seems like if nobody stole anything from these people, if nobody forced them to go watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball and pay the extra 25 cents to watch him play, whatever their individual decisions add up to in terms of a new distribution of property is a just distribution. So remember that we're not just talking about whether Wilt Chamberlain himself is entitled to this money. What we're talking about is whether the new distribution is just. Well, D2, our new distribution at the end of the season, arose from a just distribution, D1, by repeated applications of principles of justice in property transfer. How could it possibly be an unjust economic distribution, is the thought. So what are the implications here for political philosophy? Nozick's historical entitlement theory of economic justice looks very appealing to thinkers who generally hold that free and uncoerced market transactions are at the heart of economic justice. Thus, Conservative and libertarian thinkers have generally been drawn to a theory such as Nozick's. So if Nozick's theory just seems so obvious, so intuitive to you, then you might be drawn to conservative or libertarian economic theories. According to Nozick's theory, if someone is entitled to their economic holdings, that is, to their property, then the unfree or coerced taking of that property is unjust and thereby immoral. So imagine that after Wilt Chamberlain got his $250,000 additional dollars from people who decided to give him that money, somebody came up and said, "We're going to take a whole bunch of that money now, Wilt Chamberlain. That's our money now." That would be unjust according to Nozick. But this happens all the time. All taxation, unless that taxation is the result of some prior free and uncoerced market agreement, although we don't usually use the term taxation for free market agreements, is immoral. All taxation is immoral. It doesn't matter whether this taxation is employed to support national defense or infrastructure or welfare or anything else deemed vitally important. Unless a person freely and in an uncoerced fashion decides to fund some project, their money cannot be taken from them by force to fund that project. Now imagine somebody might say, well, look, we can't have a state unless people decide to fund the state, and people won't decide to fund the state unless we take their money from them via taxes. What the supporter of Nozick should say is that, well, then the state is immoral. If the only way you can have a state is by violating the principles of justice in economic distributions, then that state is an unjust, immoral state. If it's your money, if people decided to give it to you, what right does the government have to take it from you? Why would the government have any more right to take it from you than I would? I can't just show up at your house and steal your money. Why is the government allowed to do that? Well, normally we say something like the government is allowed to do it because that's the function of the government, to tax people for projects that benefit everybody. But that's just saying, isn't it, that the function of the government is to violate principles of justice? Just because we've set up an organization as an unjust organization doesn't make the things that organization does magically just, acceptable, moral. As you can see, this is a very compelling theory of economic justice. Here are three initial worries, however, for Nozick's theory. These are three things that we need to think about. So the theory is simple, it's elegant, and it's intuitive. It also seems to preserve freedom and property rights, and to be in line with the market-based economy that most people, at least in the United States, prefer. There are many, however, worries for Nozick. Here we're going to look at three of them. The first worry is that Nozick's theory pays no attention to end-state principles. The second is that his entitlement theory seems to conflict with a plausible theory of what people deserve. And finally, there has been near universal initial and transfer injustice. We'll look at these in turn. First, no attention paid to end-state principles. You might say, yes, that's the point of Nozick's theory. Isn't it? Many people think that in general markets are a good way to distribute property and to determine the justice in economic holdings. However, many also think that there's at least some limit to how far market transactions ought to be allowed to go. People think that if we pay no attention at all to at least some minimal end state principles, then things can end up very bad for some or even all of us. Consider this. It's not impossible, according to Nozick's theory, for there to be a just and acceptable economic distribution in which one person has all of the property and nobody else has anything. So long as we got there via just transfers of property or just initial acquisitions, there's nothing wrong. It's further not impossible for there to be a just economic distribution in which some people are literally starving to death because others refuse to help them. It's not impossible for there to be a just economic distribution in which nobody funds the police, the firefighters, national defense. They don't want to, and nobody's allowed to take their money from them to fund these things. But most people think that we need to pay at least some attention to minimal end state principles, some sort of last resort if everything else fails set of principles. However, Nozick's theory says that last resort principles in the form of end state principles of economic justice are always immoral. Funding national defense, funding firefighters or police officers or a welfare safety net, it's all immoral according to Nozick, unless people decide freely and in an uncoerced fashion to fund those things. A second initial problem for Nozick's theory is that it seems to ignore a very important concept, the concept of desert. So while Nozick's theory is built around the concept of entitlement, what people are entitled to, someone might think that Nozick has left out a very important concept, that of desert, what people deserve to have. This isn't dessert like what you have after dinner. That's dessert with 2 S's. This is dessert with 1 S, what you deserve to have. Now, this isn't saying that we need to be concerned with end state principles. Desert doesn't need to be an end state principle. It can be a historical principle. You deserve this for historical reasons. Consider this. You're born into a destitute family that can provide you with nothing. Do you deserve your poverty? No, that doesn't sound right. Most people would say no, that it's awful that this happened. You don't deserve to be poor. It's not as though you had a bunch of money and you made foolish decisions. You were born into nothing. But then consider this. You're born into an extremely wealthy family that can provide you with more than you could ever possibly want. Do you deserve your wealth? Well, since we said no in the poverty case, that you don't deserve your poverty, shouldn't we also say no here, that you don't deserve your wealth? In the poverty case, it wasn't as if you made foolish decisions with your money and lost it all. And in this case, the wealth case, it's not as though you've made very wise decisions with your money. You were born into wealth. But if people can be born into situations that they don't deserve, then in what sense can we say that people are entitled to the economic situation that they were, by no fault of their own, born into? If you don't deserve the economic situation that you were born into, then you might not be entitled to all of the economic advantages that you get. That means that we would need to put some other principles in place here to make sense of a redistribution of some of the wealth, perhaps. And if we redistributed some of the wealth, there'd be nothing wrong with it, since because people don't deserve a lot of the time what they have because they were born into it, they're not entitled to it. And we can take some of it away and give it to other people without violating rules of entitlement. One final initial problem for Nozick is near universal past injustice. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we buy the entirety of Nozick's theory. We say, sure, free and uncoerced transactions are the only ones that can result in just transfers of property. Property can only initially be acquired if that initial acquisition doesn't violate the Lockean proviso, and violations of the principles of justice necessitate rectification of those injustices by giving things back to the people that those things were stolen from, something like that. So let's say we say, yes, Nozick is right. What does that mean for our lives today? For nearly everything that you and I claim to own, we can trace that thing back to an initially unjust distribution or to an unjust transfer of property. If you say, well, hold on a second, I bought what I have from a store, I didn't steal it. What do you mean here? Well, consider where the land that we call the United States of America came from historically. There were people here before we showed up, took the land, killed most of them, and called this the United States of America. Or consider why your electronics and cars and appliances are so cheap. It's not just because people in other countries are happy to work for mere subsistence wages. It's because they have no other choice. In many cases, it's because they didn't even make a choice to work in that factory. They had to. In a lot of cases, it's because the materials for those things were taken from people. Consider why you're able to live the life that you live. Why is it that we're doing so well in much of the West, while people in the global South and emerging nations are doing so poorly? It's not because we have made wonderful choices. It's because we've exported the poverty that would have existed in the United States to other countries by opening up the market to the entire world, not paying people in countries that don't have minimum wage laws or restrictions on how long people can work, acceptable wages, or having them work in acceptable working conditions. That's why we're able to have so much for so little. But all of that would be unjust according to Nozick. So if we really want to be good free marketeers, if we really want to be good economic conservatives, libertarians, we are morally required, according to Nozick, according to the principles of economic conservatism, according to libertarianism, according to the principles of justice in the free market, to give up most of what we have and to stop participating in most of the economic activities that we participate in. Now, what could you do in response to these claims? Well, you could stop free marketeer. You could say, well, look, we're allowed to have the land that we have in the United States because we were stronger and we took it from other people. That's an anti-market principle. Theft is not in line with the market. You could say that, or you could say, if we can make people work for starvation wages, if we can force them to do that, we're allowed to have the stuff that they produce for us. You can say that, but that's an anti-market principle. So in order to preserve the life that we have, you need to be against much of what we generally consider to be market principles. Or you could continue to be a free marketeer and give most of what you have back. So those are your choices. In this lecture, we've taken a look at Robert Nozick's historical entitlement theory of economic justice that says that an economic distribution is just insofar as it arises from a previous just distribution by repeated applications of principles of justice in acquisition, transfer, and abandonment, and that if any of those principles is violated, we need to rectify that injustice in some way. Robert Nozick's theory has traditionally been adopted by economic conservatives and libertarians, although we saw a number of problems with Nozick's theory. It seems like the theory, even though it's simple, intuitive, elegant, requires quite a bit more justification than it has initially been given. And even further, the theory might end up justifying requirements on us to give up most of what we have. Generally, you don't hear libertarians or economic conservatives claiming that the stuff we have was all stolen. But since according to the principles that generally run market ethical systems, we're required to give up all of this stuff, or at least most of it, because we did in fact steal it, that might necessitate either a giving up of market principles or a radical restructuring of our economic system to make up for past injustices. Thank you.